I never told my family about my surgery. Not because I was ashamed of the procedure itself, but because I had learned, the hard way, that my family had never celebrated anything I did without twisting it into criticism or blame. My entire childhood was a minefield of their expectations, punishments, and silent resentments, all directed at me, all for reasons I could never fully understand. Every achievement felt temporary, every compliment meaningless, and every mistake magnified until it became a defining mark of who I was supposed to be, the one who failed them. Growing up, I had learned to keep my thoughts, feelings, and even my body to myself. If I scraped my knee, it was my fault for being clumsy. If I got an A in school, it wasn't good enough, they expected perfection. If I spoke up about my needs or desires, it was called selfishness. Over the years, I internalized it all, building walls so high and so thick that no one, not even me, could easily climb them. When I finally realized I needed surgery, it wasn't a casual decision. My health had been deteriorating silently for years, but the thought of telling them, my parents, my siblings, filled me with anxiety. I imagined their questions, their disapproving looks, the implicit judgment that I had somehow brought this upon myself. Their voices echoed in my mind. Why didn't you take better care of yourself? You always overreact. We warned you this would happen. And so, I made the choice to face it alone. The days leading up to the procedure were a strange mix of fear and determination. I told no one but my doctor and the nurse who handled the pre-op instructions. I scheduled the surgery for early morning to minimize questions, and I took care of every logistical detail myself: transportation, payment, recovery arrangements. I even created a small kit for my recovery at home: pain medications, soft clothes, meals I could prepare without much effort. Every step I took reinforced a sense of independence I had rarely experienced in my life. On the morning of the surgery, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. As I was wheeled into the operating room, I thought of my family, the people who had shaped my fears and insecurities so thoroughly, and I felt a tiny spark of pride. I was taking control of my own body, my own health, and my own life. For the first time, I was acting solely for myself, without fear of their disapproval or judgment. The surgery itself was a blur. I woke hours later in a haze of pain and relief, the first pangs of recovery already beginning. The nurses were kind, attentive, and professional, everything my family had never been. For the first time in a long while, I felt cared for without conditions. The next few days were difficult, of course. Pain, grogginess, and the vulnerability of being dependent on my own planning forced me to confront just how isolated I had always been. Yet in that isolation, I also found clarity. Recovery was slow. Every movement, every attempt to get out of bed, reminded me that my body was both fragile and resilient. I documented everything in a journal: pain levels, emotional fluctuations, fears, and triumphs. Writing it all down became a therapy of sorts, a conversation with myself that I had never allowed when I was growing up. I realized that for decades, I had silenced my own voice to avoid criticism, and now I was rediscovering the power of speaking, if only to myself. Weeks passed, and my body healed, but the emotional journey was far from over. I thought about my family constantly. I wondered how they would react if they knew the truth. Would they criticize my decision? Blame me for not telling them sooner? Turn my recovery into another lesson in failure? The more I imagined their responses, the more I realized I didn't care anymore. Their approval had never truly mattered. What mattered was my health, my autonomy, and my self-respect. Slowly, I began reintegrating myself into daily life. I resumed work, social interactions, and small personal projects I had abandoned over the years due to their constant scrutiny. I realized I had been living cautiously for them, molding my actions to fit their expectations. Surgery, and the choice to hide it, became a turning point. I wasn't just recovering physically, I was reclaiming the right to make decisions for myself. Months after the procedure, I finally started contemplating how to address my family. Not out of obligation, but out of a desire to test my own boundaries. I considered telling them the truth, imagining their faces, their voices. I pictured their disbelief, the accusations, and the judgment. And then I imagined myself firm and unwavering, saying, I did this for me. Not for you. Not to prove anything. I did it because it was necessary. That thought alone brought a sense of empowerment I had never known. Even now, years later, I reflect on that time as the moment I fully realized my own strength. Surgery was not merely a medical procedure, it was a symbolic act of autonomy, an assertion of self in a life that had been defined by others' control. I learned that keeping secrets from toxic influences is sometimes a necessary form of self-preservation. I discovered that independence is not just about survival, but about thriving despite the shadow of judgment and past trauma. Through it all, I also began seeking relationships that honored my boundaries. Friendships and partnerships with people who respected my autonomy became central to my life. I learned to value empathy, understanding, and mutual support, and I finally understood that love and care should never come at the cost of self-erasure. Keeping my surgery a secret from my family was one of the hardest decisions I have ever made, but it was also one of the most transformative. It taught me to trust myself, to honor my needs, and to stand firm in my own life. I am not defined by their criticism, their punishment, or their expectations. I am defined by my choices, my resilience, and my capacity to reclaim my own body, my own mind, and my own life. Growing up, I can still remember the constant atmosphere of tension in our house. My parents had this way of turning every situation into a lesson about my supposed inadequacy. A scraped knee wasn't just an accident, it was proof that I was careless, reckless, and irresponsible. A good grade wasn't celebrated, it was a reminder that I could do better, that I wasn't reaching my full potential. Birthdays were an exercise in disappointment. No matter how much effort I put into a celebration, it never met their standard. I learned to shrink into myself, to anticipate their criticisms, to speak less and absorb more. My siblings weren't exempt either. The older ones often parroted my parents' words, teasing me for minor mistakes or mocking my efforts. They didn't see me, they saw a target, an extension of the rules I was supposed to follow. By the time I reached adolescence, I had perfected the art of invisibility. I became quiet, compliant, and careful, always calculating the safest way to exist in a home that felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. That mindset followed me well into adulthood. Even after I moved out, even after I carved out a life of my own, I still felt that echoing voice of criticism. Every decision, every choice, was filtered through the lens of what my family would think. And that's why the thought of telling them about my surgery filled me with dread. They would never see it as a necessary medical procedure. They would see it as another opportunity to judge, another chance to make me feel small. When I finally went through with the surgery, I had to plan everything meticulously. The fear of running into someone who might tell my family was real. I took a taxi to the hospital instead of asking a friend for a ride, booked the earliest appointment to minimize attention, and kept all my recovery supplies carefully tucked away. The secrecy felt heavy, but it was a burden I was willing to bear for the sake of my own peace. During the recovery, the nights were the hardest. Alone in my apartment, wrapped in blankets, I wrestled not just with physical pain, but with old fears. Memories of my parents' disappointed faces, their cold words, and their harsh punishments rose unbidden. I wanted to cry, to scream, to tell someone, but there was no one I could tell who would understand without twisting my story into judgment. So, I wrote. Pages and pages in a journal, sometimes in messy scrawls, sometimes in neat paragraphs. I poured every fear, every ache, every memory into that journal. Writing became the only way I could speak without being silenced. In the weeks that followed, as the physical pain eased, I felt a sense of pride slowly building. I had made it through without their interference, without their criticism, without their judgment. I was standing on my own, taking responsibility for my body, my health, and my life. That realization was powerful, almost intoxicating. It was the first time I had felt truly autonomous, and it changed me. I began to see the patterns more clearly, how their punishment shaped my behavior, how their criticism conditioned me to doubt myself, and how much I had sacrificed my own happiness just to avoid their wrath. I realized that freedom wasn't about leaving them behind entirely, it was about reclaiming the parts of myself that they had tried to control, about living without their approval, and about trusting my own judgment. Over time, I slowly reintegrated into my social life, reconnecting with friends I had neglected and forming new relationships with people who respected me. I set boundaries I had never dared to set before. I learned to say no without fear, to prioritize my needs, and to protect myself from anyone who sought to diminish me. And in doing so, I discovered a new kind of confidence, one that wasn't dependent on approval or validation. Eventually, my family found out about the surgery. I hadn't planned on telling them, but a distant relative let it slip, and the news spread quickly. I braced myself for the familiar wave of criticism, judgment, and blame. But when they called and asked about it, I spoke calmly, matter-of-factly. I explained why I had done it, why I had kept it secret, and why it was necessary for my health. To my surprise, there was silence on the other end of the line. No lecture, no accusations. Just silence. And in that silence, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I realized that I no longer needed their approval. Their opinions were just that, opinions. My life, my choices, my body, they belonged to me alone. Looking back now, keeping my surgery a secret was not an act of deceit, but of survival and self-preservation. It taught me that my autonomy is non-negotiable, that my health and well-being are paramount, and that sometimes the hardest decisions, those we make quietly, alone, are the ones that define our strength. I had lived under their shadow for decades, absorbing blame and criticism like it was oxygen. But in reclaiming my body, my health, and my choices, I found something deeper, a sense of self-worth that no one could diminish. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to live for myself. After the secret of my surgery inevitably reached my family, I braced myself for confrontation, for lectures, for the old familiar pattern of judgment and blame. But instead, what I encountered was surprisingly muted. My parents called, their voices heavy with curiosity and confusion rather than anger. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, a question that sounded simple on the surface but carried years of expectation, fear, and disappointment beneath it. I took a deep breath, recalling every childhood lesson about saying the wrong thing. I spoke slowly, carefully, but firmly, because this was my decision. My body, my health, my life. I needed to do this for me. There was a pause. I could hear them breathing, processing, resisting their instinct to criticize. My father finally said, We just didn't want you to go through something dangerous alone." And I realized something important in that moment. Even after decades of criticism, even after a childhood steeped in punishment, the truth has a way of carving space where judgment once ruled. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their understanding. Their voices no longer held power over my choices. Over the next weeks, interactions with my family became a study in boundaries. They tried to overstep, to insert their opinions on my diet, my exercise, my ongoing recovery. And each time, I practiced saying no gently but unflinchingly. It was strange at first, my body still tensed when they spoke, an old reflex from years of walking on eggshells. But I persisted, reminding myself that autonomy isn't given, it's defended. I also discovered a strange kind of liberation in reclaiming my independence. Without the constant scrutiny of my family, I could pursue personal goals I had shelved for years. I started working on long-abandoned projects, from writing essays about my experiences to tackling hobbies that had once been criticized as frivolous. Each small victory reinforced a truth I had long resisted: I could exist, thrive, and be happy on my own terms. During this period, I formed deeper connections with friends who had supported me quietly over the years. These were people who never judged, who never compared me to anyone else, who never made me feel like I had to earn their love or respect. Dinner parties, late-night conversations, long walks in the park, they became a lifeline, a reminder that human connection doesn't have to come with a price of self-erasure. Even with newfound strength, the shadow of my past lingered. Old insecurities resurfaced at unexpected moments, when a friend offered advice I didn't take, when I faced a medical checkup, when I even glanced at old family photos. But I learned to confront those moments not with shame or fear, but with self-compassion. I reminded myself that trauma does not define the limits of your life, it simply marks where you started to fight back. Months turned into years. The surgery itself became a distant memory, but the act of taking control continued to influence every decision I made. I nurtured my independence, cultivated relationships based on mutual respect, and built a life that was no longer dictated by the expectations or criticisms of my family. My career flourished in ways it never could have if I had remained shackled by their influence. I traveled, took risks, and embraced experiences I had long denied myself. Eventually, I realized that my decision to keep the surgery secret wasn't just about protecting myself, it was a lesson in personal sovereignty. It was a declaration that my life, my body, and my choices were mine to govern. And in making that choice, I discovered a resilience I hadn't known existed, a strength that no amount of criticism or punishment could diminish. Looking back, the surgery was more than a medical procedure. It was a turning point, a statement of self-preservation, and a reclaiming of my own narrative. I no longer allowed past patterns of blame to dictate my happiness. I no longer needed validation from those who had spent my childhood teaching me to doubt myself. I finally understood that the most important approval comes from within, and that's the approval that truly matters. I am not defined by their criticism, their disappointment, or the punishments of my past. I am defined by my choices, my courage, and the life I have created despite their efforts to diminish me. Hiding the surgery was not an act of secrecy, it was an act of empowerment, a step toward freedom, and the beginning of a life lived unapologetically on my own terms. And every day since, I have carried that lesson forward. My body, my decisions, and my life are mine. I am the author of my own story, and I will never allow anyone to write it for me again. I can still remember the day my childhood shifted from minor punishments to something more insidious, the day I realized that nothing I did would ever be enough for my family. I was 8 years old, and I had painted a picture for my mother's birthday. It was bright, full of colors, and carefully made, every stroke deliberate. I proudly handed it to her, hoping for a smile, for a word of encouragement. Instead, she frowned. "This is sloppy," she said. "Why didn't you follow the lines? You could have done better." Her words stung, not just because they were critical, but because they came without kindness, without any recognition of my effort. I remember my little hands trembling as I took back the painting, my stomach knotting into a permanent reminder I was never allowed to be enough. From that day forward, I learned to hide my efforts, to temper my enthusiasm, to preempt criticism by lowering my expectations. Every success had to be muted, every joy carefully rationed. School projects, sports achievements, even friendships, they were all subject to her judgment or my father's distant disapproval. I learned quickly that my emotions, my body, my choices, and even my health could not be freely expressed without consequence. By the time I was a teenager, this fear had become a constant companion. When I scraped my knee in gym class, I minimized the pain to avoid hearing, "Why were you so careless?" When I received a good grade, I suppressed my excitement because it would inevitably be followed by, "You could have done better." Every action, every feeling, every choice became a calculated maneuver to avoid punishment or shame. So when I learned that I needed surgery in adulthood, the old patterns flared instantly. My parents' voices echoed in my head, "You're overreacting. This is dramatic. You'll regret it." I felt my old fears rise. What if they blamed me for needing the surgery? What if they said I had been careless with my health all along? It was terrifying, not because the procedure itself was dangerous, but because the psychological weight of their judgment was heavier than any physical pain I could imagine. I planned the surgery meticulously. I scheduled it early in the morning, avoiding days when anyone from the extended family might check in. I prepared my apartment with everything I would need: soft blankets, easy-to-make meals, pain medication, and books to distract me. I told no one. Not a friend, not a coworker, not anyone who might inadvertently relay news back to them. For the first time in my life, I was making a choice entirely for myself. The morning of the surgery, I was nervous, but determined. The taxi ride to the hospital felt like a journey toward freedom. Every mile that passed, I imagined leaving behind not just my fear, but decades of judgment and criticism. In the waiting room, I held my hands together tightly, taking deep breaths. I reminded myself, this is my choice. My body, my life, my decision. The procedure itself was disorienting. I remember waking up, the anesthesia leaving a fog over my mind, the dull ache in my body, and the strange quiet of the hospital room. There were nurses, gentle and professional, checking on me, administering medication, and explaining the recovery steps. For the first time, I experienced care without judgment. I allowed myself to feel vulnerable, and for once, I didn't punish myself for it. The recovery period was arduous. The pain was real. But the emotional struggle was even more taxing. Alone in my apartment, I had to navigate every task, every movement, every meal, every discomfort without guidance or comfort from those who had raised me. I realized how much I had relied on their approval in the past and how much that approval had always been conditional. Writing became my anchor. I poured my fears, frustrations, and reflections into a journal, sometimes in messy handwriting, sometimes in careful sentences. It was the first time I allowed myself to speak freely, to process the trauma of my upbringing, and to acknowledge my resilience. With every entry, I reclaimed a little piece of myself that had been lost under years of punishment and criticism. Weeks turned into months, and the physical wounds healed. The emotional ones took longer, but I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I was no longer shrinking from my own desires. I no longer silenced my thoughts to avoid judgment. I began asserting boundaries with my family, gently but firmly, making it clear that my body, my health, and my decisions were mine. I discovered an unexpected liberation in claiming my autonomy, a joy I had never known as a child or teenager. When my family finally learned of the surgery, I anticipated the same old pattern: blame, scolding, disapproval. But their reactions were surprisingly muted. I calmly explained why I had made the choice, emphasizing that it was necessary for my well-being. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. I realized I didn't need their approval or understanding. My choice had already been made. And I had already taken control of my life. Since then, my life has evolved in profound ways. I cultivated relationships built on respect and empathy, rekindled friendships that had been neglected, and pursued personal and professional goals without fear of criticism. The surgery, once a secret weighed down by fear, became a symbol of empowerment. It reminded me daily that I have the right to act in my own best interest, to value my health, and to protect my autonomy, no matter the expectations or judgments of others. I am not defined by my family's criticisms or the punishments of my past. I am defined by my resilience, my decisions, and my capacity to reclaim my life. Keeping my surgery secret was not an act of deception, it was an act of self-preservation, courage, and the assertion of independence I had been denied for decades. And every day since, I have carried that lesson forward: my life is mine, and no one has the power to dictate it.